luxury hotel, a raging storm, and a housekeeper who sees something she was never supposed to witness. Tonight, billionaire Samuel Whitmore checks in with his beloved twin granddaughters. But when one of them mysteriously disappears, a secret buried for years begins to unravel. Why does Eleanor, a simple hotel maid, feel an inexplicable connection to the children? Why does the past seem to whisper in every dark hallway? And most importantly, what happens when forgotten memories resurface at the worst possible moment? The truth will break hearts, destroy lives, and change everything you thought you knew. Stay until the end because nothing is what it seems. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The storm roared outside, slamming against the towering glass windows of the Hudson Grand Hotel, the rain pelting down in heavy sheets as if trying to drown the city beneath it. The hotel lobby gleamed under golden chandeliers, filled with murmurs of wealthy guests checking in, their designer luggage rolling across the marble floors. But amidst the elegance, there was an unease in the air, an electricity that made the hairs on the back of Eleanor Hayes's neck stand on end. She had worked at the Hudson Grand for years, polishing silver trays, tucking in crisp white sheets, and making sure every room carried the scent of fresh linen and lavender. Yet tonight, something felt different, wrong. As she adjusted the collar of her uniform and moved toward the grand hallway leading to the elevators, she caught a glimpse of the man who had just checked in, Samuel Whitmore. The name itself sent a whisper through the staff, a billionaire so powerful that his presence alone seemed to shift the air. But Eleanor wasn't staring at him because of his wealth. It was because of the two little girls standing at his side, clutching his hands, their identical faces peering up at him with wide blue eyes. A strange pressure gripped Eleanor's chest, her breath catching as if the very sight of them pulled at something deep inside her, something she couldn't name. "Eleanor," a voice called, snapping her back to reality. She turned sharply to see Rose, the front desk receptionist, waving her over with an urgent look in her eyes. "Can you help escort Mr. Whitmore and his granddaughters to their suite? The storm's making everyone a little uneasy, and I'd rather get them settled quickly." Eleanor hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, her hands smoothing down her apron as she approached them. Samuel Whitmore barely spared her a glance, distracted as he checked his gold pocket watch. But the girls, they stared at her. Emily and Olivia, their eyes locked onto Eleanor as if they recognized her, as if she were someone important. But that was impossible. She had never met them before. Had she? "This way, Mr. Whitmore," Eleanor said, her voice steady, leading them toward the elevator. The girls whispered to each other as they followed, their footsteps light against the thick carpet. And when they stepped into the grand elevator, Eleanor pressed the button for the penthouse suite. The ride up was silent except for the distant sound of thunder rumbling through the sky. As the golden doors slid open, Eleanor led them through the luxurious hallway, finally stopping in front of room 2501. She swiped the keycard and pushed the door open, revealing a suite that looked more like a palace than a hotel room. High ceilings, velvet armchairs, a fireplace flickering against the rain-streaked windows. "Your bags will be brought up shortly," she said, stepping aside as the billionaire entered first. But as she turned to leave, a small hand grasped her wrist. Eleanor flinched, looking down to see Olivia, her small fingers curled tightly around Eleanor's sleeve. "Do you remember us?" the girl asked in a whisper so soft, so uncertain, that Eleanor felt her heart stutter. She blinked, her mind struggling to make sense of the question. I don't think so, sweetheart," Eleanor said carefully, kneeling slightly to be at eye level with her. "But maybe you remind me of someone." Olivia's grip loosened, and she turned to look at her sister. Emily stared at Eleanor, her expression unreadable. Before Eleanor could say anything else, Samuel's voice cut through the room like a sharp blade. "Girls, it's late," he said, his tone firm but tired. "Say goodnight to the nice lady." Emily nodded, but Olivia hesitated for a moment before whispering, "Good night, Eleanor." Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine. She had never told them her name. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but as she walked down the hallway, her mind was spinning. There was something about those girls, something familiar, something she couldn't quite place. The air in the hotel felt thicker, heavier. That night, as she made her way back to the housekeeping staff quarters, she couldn't shake the unease coiling in her stomach. She tried to convince herself it was just a coincidence, just a trick of her mind. But then, a letter. It was waiting for her outside her locker. No stamp, no address, just a single folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. "They are closer than you think." The breath caught in her throat. She looked around, but the hallway was empty, the hum of the hotel's air conditioning the only sound in the eerie silence. Someone had left this for her. But who? And what did it mean? A soft knock echoed down the hall, making her jump. She turned sharply, but there was no one there. The lights flickered for a second, a reminder of the raging storm outside. Heart pounding, she clutched the letter tightly, shoving it into the pocket of her uniform before locking up and heading to her small staff apartment. That night, she dreamt of a nursery bathed in golden light, the sound of babies crying, and a lullaby sung in a voice she almost recognized. She woke up with a start, her chest heaving, the taste of something forgotten but important lingering at the edge of her mind. And then, just as she was about to convince herself it was only a dream, she noticed something on her bedside table. Another letter, but this time it was worse, because the paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and it had her own handwriting on it. And it said just 3 words, "Don't forget them." Her blood turned to ice. She had written this, but she didn't remember. The storm outside roared louder, shaking the windows, the rain slamming against the glass. Eleanor clutched the letter to her chest, her heart pounding against her ribs. Something was very, very wrong, and for the first time in years, she was terrified of what she might remember. Eleanor stood frozen in her small, dimly lit apartment, the yellowed letter trembling between her fingers. The words stared back at her like a ghost from the past. Don't forget them, her own handwriting, but she had no memory of ever writing it. Her breath was shallow, her pulse pounding against her temples. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the city, the wind howling like a desperate whisper trying to warn her of something she had long buried. She sank onto the edge of her bed, gripping the fragile paper as if it held the key to everything she had lost. But what had she lost? Her past? A memory too painful to remember? And why did the faces of those twin girls feel like a missing piece she couldn't quite fit into place? She forced herself to take a deep breath, setting the letter down carefully as if it might disappear if she blinked too long. Perhaps it was exhaustion. A long day, the storm, the eerie feeling of déjà vu pressing in on her mind. But deep down, she knew better. Something about this wasn't normal. Someone had left her that note for a reason. Someone wanted her to remember. But remember what? She lay down, eyes wide open in the darkness, the sound of rain tapping insistently against the window. Sleep came in waves, restless and filled with flashes of things she didn't understand. Laughter echoing down a long hallway, the smell of baby powder and warm milk, soft giggles, a lullaby sung in a voice too familiar yet completely unknown. Then, a sharp, abrupt feeling of loss, a door closing, the sound of a clock ticking too loudly. She woke with a gasp, her body jolting forward, the blanket tangled around her legs. Her heart was hammering, her skin damp with sweat. The storm outside had died down to a soft drizzle, the city still wrapped in a heavy mist. Morning light barely filtered through the small window, casting eerie shadows across her room. She exhaled, trying to calm the erratic rhythm of her pulse. But as she moved to swing her legs over the side of the bed, her foot nudged something on the floor. Another letter. Her blood ran cold. She reached for it with shaky hands, unfolding it slowly, almost afraid of what it might say. Go to room 1902. The truth is waiting. Her stomach twisted. Room 1902. But the hotel only had 25 floors. There was no room 1902. And yet, something about the number felt familiar. She didn't allow herself to hesitate. She changed quickly into her uniform, tucking both notes into her pocket, her mind racing. If there was no room 1902, then why had someone left her this note? And how had they even gotten into her locked apartment to leave it? She had too many questions, and the only way to find answers was to follow the clues. The Hudson Grand Hotel was unusually quiet when she arrived. The storm had driven many guests away early, leaving the grand lobby feeling eerily empty, the chandeliers casting long golden reflections against the polished marble floors. Eleanor moved with purpose, slipping through the halls unnoticed. She knew the hotel like the back of her hand, and yet, as she made her way to the 19th floor, she felt a strange unease curling around her like an unseen force. She walked slowly down the hallway, stopping where the number 1902 should have been. Instead, there was a blank space. No door, no number, just smooth wallpaper as if the room had never existed. Her heart pounded against her ribs. This didn't make sense. She reached out hesitantly, her fingertips brushing against the wall. And then, as if sensing her touch, a faint indentation appeared beneath her fingers. A hidden door. Her breath hitched. She pressed harder, and with a soft click, the wall shifted slightly, revealing the faint outline of a doorway. A shiver ran down her spine as she felt along the edge, searching for a way to open it. Finally, after a moment of hesitation, she found a small panel near the floor, barely noticeable. She pressed it. A soft mechanical sound rumbled beneath the surface, and slowly, the door slid open. Cold air rushed out. The scent of dust, paper, and something faintly floral filled her nose. The room inside was dark, untouched for years, the only illumination coming from the hallway behind her. She stepped inside cautiously. The room was a nursery. Eleanor's throat closed. Faded wallpaper of pale blue and soft yellow decorated the walls. Tiny stars and moons scattered across them. Two identical cribs sat against the far end of the room, covered in white sheets now dulled with time. A rocking chair, its wooden frame worn from years of use, sat in the corner beside a small bookshelf filled with old children's books. Her legs felt weak. What was this place? And why did she feel like she had been here before? Her fingers trailed over the edge of one of the cribs, her chest tightening. Something achingly familiar stirred in her, but before she could process it, her eyes landed on a framed photograph sitting on a dust-covered nightstand. Slowly, she picked it up, her fingers trembling as she wiped away the dust. And then her breath caught. It was her, a younger version of herself, holding two newborn babies in her arms. Eleanor's legs nearly gave out. Her mind screamed at her that this wasn't possible, that this had to be some kind of mistake. She would remember if she had children. Wouldn't she? Her fingers traced the image, her vision blurring. The babies in the photograph, tiny, identical, wrapped in soft white blankets. And pinned to the bottom corner of the frame was a note. "You were never meant to forget." A sob clawed at her throat. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. This wasn't just a feeling. She had lost something unforgivable. The air in the room felt heavier, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She could barely breathe as memories whispered at the edges of her mind, begging to be let in. But before she could process it, a noise, a soft click outside the hidden door. Eleanor's head snapped up. Someone was out there, watching her. Her pulse skyrocketed as she turned to the entrance. The door, which had been slightly ajar, was now fully closed. Panic surged through her veins. She wasn't alone. A shadow passed under the thin gap at the bottom of the door. She held her breath, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Silence stretched around her, heavy and thick. Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest. Whoever had been there, they had left. Or were they waiting? She forced herself to move, clutching the photograph in her trembling hands. She had to get out of there. She had to find out the truth. But one thing was certain. Someone didn't want her remembering. Eleanor stood frozen in the dimly lit nursery, her heart hammering so loudly she could barely hear anything else. The photograph in her trembling hands felt like it was burning into her skin, a silent testament to a past she should remember but didn't. The image of herself, smiling, radiant, holding two newborn babies, was undeniable. The truth was there, staring at her. But her mind refused to fill in the gaps. Her breath hitched as she stared at the sealed door, her fingers clenching around the frame. Someone had been watching. Someone had closed the door. Someone knew she was here, knew what she had just discovered. For a long moment, she didn't move. The weight of the silence pressed against her chest like an invisible hand, suffocating, crushing. The air in the hidden nursery felt thick, unmoving, as if it had been trapped in time. Dust floated lazily through the single sliver of light filtering in from the hallway crack beneath the door, its soft glow barely illuminating the forgotten room. Then, a noise outside, soft, cautious, the sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. Whoever had been standing there just moments ago was leaving. Eleanor's throat tightened as she forced herself to move, her muscles stiff with fear. She tiptoed toward the door, pressing her ear against the cool surface, listening for anything. Breathing, movement, another sound that would confirm she was still being watched. Nothing, just silence. Slowly, she turned the knob, inching the door open just enough to peek into the hallway. The long corridor stretched out before her, dim and empty, the golden sconces casting faint pools of light against the velvet wallpaper. The hotel had an eerie stillness at this hour, as if the storm outside had stolen all the noise, leaving only an unsettling quiet behind. She stepped out, her pulse a drumbeat against her ribs. Her gaze flickered left, then right, scanning for any sign of the person who had been standing at her door. No one. But as she turned to close the hidden entrance behind her, something else caught her eye. A single golden cufflink lay on the plush carpet, gleaming under the hallway light. Eleanor swallowed hard. That wasn't there before. Carefully, she bent down, picking it up between her fingers. The metal was warm, as if someone had just dropped it. She turned it over, her breath catching at what she saw engraved on the back. W. Her stomach clenched. Whitmore. She straightened abruptly, her pulse surging with adrenaline. Had Samuel Whitmore been here? Was he the one who had been watching her? So why would he hide from her? What did he know? The questions burned through her, demanding answers. But she couldn't ask them, not yet. Not until she had more proof, more certainty about what was happening. She slipped the cufflink into her pocket, tucking the photograph beneath her uniform, then turned on her heel and hurried toward the staff stairwell. She needed to get out of there before someone realized she had been snooping where she didn't belong. Her footsteps echoed against the stairwell walls as she descended quickly, her mind racing. Had she really been the mother of those girls? Had Samuel Whitmore taken them from her? Or was there an even bigger secret buried beneath the surface? Something far worse than she could imagine? She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start. Samuel Whitmore's penthouse. She hesitated only for a second before making her way to the 25th floor. The hallway was quiet when she arrived, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and fresh-cut roses from the decorative vases lining the walls. The door to room 2501 stood imposingly in front of her. Locked, silent, a barrier between her and the truth. Her fingers hovered over the handle. And then, before she could second-guess herself, she knocked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door creaked open. Eleanor's breath caught as she stepped inside. The suite was vast and elegantly furnished, dimly lit by the flickering glow of a fireplace. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, its golden reflections dancing across the polished floor. Everything about the space exuded wealth, power, control. And then, across the room, she saw him. Samuel Whitmore sat in a high-backed chair by the window, his silver hair illuminated by the city lights beyond the glass. He was staring out over the skyline, a glass of whiskey balanced in his trembling hand. His eyes, distant, unfocused, drifted toward her as she stepped further into the room. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, rough with something unreadable. Eleanor swallowed, her fingers tightening around the photograph beneath her uniform. "I think I should," she countered, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I think I should have been here a long time ago." His gaze flickered, something passing behind his eyes. a crack in his carefully constructed facade. "Do you remember them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emily and Olivia?" Samuel exhaled sharply, his grip on the whiskey glass tightening. "Of course I remember them," he murmured. "They're my granddaughters." Eleanor took a step closer, her pulse pounding. "But are they mine?" Silence. Samuel didn't move, didn't blink. But something shifted in the air between them. Something heavy, something unspoken. Eleanor reached into her pocket, pulling out the cufflink. She held it up, letting it catch the light. "You were outside room 1902, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. For the first time, Samuel Whitmore looked afraid. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting away. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. Eleanor took another step forward, her breath coming fast. "You do, and you're going to tell me everything." Samuel set his glass down with a sharp clink, his expression unreadable. The weight of the moment pressed down on both of them, the storm outside long forgotten. Finally, after a long pause, he exhaled, rubbing a hand over his lined face. "I was trying to protect you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's stomach dropped. "From what?" His gaze lifted to meet hers. "From the truth." A shiver ran down her spine. She opened her mouth to demand more, but before she could, a knock echoed at the suite's door. Both of them turned, tension snapping tight in the room. Samuel's expression darkened. "Don't open it," he murmured, but Eleanor was already moving, because deep down she knew, whoever was on the other side of that door, they didn't want her to know the truth, and she was about to find out why. The knock echoed through the penthouse like a warning, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the heavy silence between Eleanor and Samuel. Her hand hovered near the doorknob, her breath shallow as she felt the weight of an unseen force pressing down on her. Something inside her screamed, "Don't open it," but she couldn't listen to fear now. Not when she was this close to unraveling the truth. Samuel, still seated in his grand chair by the window, exhaled heavily, his jaw tightening. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice carrying an urgency that sent a chill down her spine. "Walk away, right now, before it's too late." She turned to him, the unease in his eyes making her pulse race. "Too late for what?" The knock came again, louder this time. Her fingers curled around the doorknob, heart pounding in her chest. Samuel's voice was strained now. "You don't understand what you're stepping into." "I think I finally do," she whispered, before twisting the knob and pulling the door open. The hallway outside was dimly lit, the golden sconces casting long, eerie shadows against the dark wallpaper. And standing just beyond the threshold was a woman Eleanor had never seen before. Yet something about her felt strangely familiar. She was tall, poised, impeccably dressed in an emerald green coat with delicate pearl buttons. A diamond bracelet glittered at her wrist as she held a sleek black purse against her hip. Her hair, perfectly styled, was the color of midnight, sleek and smooth. But it was her eyes that made Eleanor's stomach twist into knots. Cold, calculating, knowing. The woman's lips curved into the faintest smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good evening," she said smoothly. "I was hoping to have a word with Mr. Whitmore." Eleanor swallowed hard, glancing back at Samuel, whose expression had darkened considerably. His fingers tightened around the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, edged with something dangerously close to fear. The woman ignored him, her sharp gaze flickering back to Eleanor. "And you must be Eleanor Hayes." A shiver ran down her spine. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease crawling up her throat. The woman's smile widened just slightly. "Oh, my dear," she murmured, tilting her head ever so slightly. "You've been at the center of this for far longer than you realize." Eleanor's breath hitched. She tightened her grip on the door. "Who are you?" A pause. Then, "My name is Vivian Lancaster," the woman said, stepping forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "And I believe we have much to discuss." Samuel let out a sharp breath, standing slowly from his chair. Vivian, don't. But Eleanor had heard that name before. Somewhere in the depths of her mind, it rang like a distant bell, its sound shrouded in fog, a memory she couldn't quite reach. Vivian turned slightly, addressing Samuel with a chilling kind of familiarity. "There's no point in keeping secrets anymore, Samuel," she said. "Not when she's already started remembering." Eleanor's stomach twisted. "Remembering what?" Vivian's eyes locked onto hers. "Who you really are." Silence fell over the room like a suffocating weight. Eleanor's breath came faster now, her mind spinning. "Tell me the truth," she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel pressed a hand to his forehead, exhaling through his nose. "Eleanor, you're not ready. Enough." Vivian's voice was soft but razor-sharp. "She deserves to know." Samuel's gaze darkened. "She deserves peace." Vivian scoffed. "Peace?" She turned back to Eleanor. "Is that what you feel right now?" Eleanor didn't answer. She couldn't. Vivian reached into her purse, pulling out a single photograph. She held it out to Eleanor with an almost eerie patience. Eleanor hesitated before taking it. And then, as her eyes fell upon the image, the floor beneath her seemed to disappear. It was a picture of a woman holding two newborns in her arms. Not just any woman. Herself. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the image, her vision blurring. It was the same photograph from the hidden nursery. But this time there was a name written at the bottom. Eleanor Whitmore. She felt the blood drain from her face. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the photograph. The name repeated in her head over and over again. Whitmore. Not Hayes. Whitmore. She slowly lifted her gaze to Samuel, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound in the room. "Tell me," she whispered. "Tell me this isn't true." Samuel's face was pale, his hands shaking at his sides. He opened his mouth, but no words came, and that silence told her everything she needed to know. The room spun. She felt sick, lightheaded. The walls seemed to close in on her. Vivian's voice was almost gentle when she spoke. "You were never just the housekeeper, Eleanor," she said softly. "You were his daughter." The air left Eleanor's lungs in a sharp, broken gasp. No, that wasn't possible. She stumbled backward, her mind reeling. This wasn't real. Couldn't be. But deep down, in the pit of her soul, she knew. It was. She had been lied to, manipulated, stolen from her own life. And worst of all, she had forgotten her own children. The weight of the revelation crashed down on her all at once. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, she felt something break inside her. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, her breath shuddering as she shook her head, as if denying it would somehow make it untrue. Samuel took a step toward her. "Eleanor, please." But she stepped back, her pulse roaring in her ears. "No." His face crumpled. "I did what I had to do." Her chest ached with a pain so raw it felt unbearable. "You took them from me." Samuel's eyes glistened. "No, But Eleanor couldn't hear anything else. Not over the sound of her own breaking heart. She turned and walked out of the penthouse. She didn't stop when Samuel called after her. She didn't stop when Vivian's gaze followed her with quiet curiosity. She didn't stop when the walls of the Hudson Grand felt like they were closing in. She had lost everything. And the worst part? She hadn't even known it. Eleanor walked blindly through the corridors of the Hudson Grand, her breath uneven, her thoughts tangled in a storm she couldn't control. The revelation sat like a lead weight in her chest, suffocating, unrelenting. She was Samuel Whitmore's daughter. She was the mother of Emily and Olivia. She had been lied to, erased, stolen from her own life. And she had believed it. Every day for years, she had woken up as Eleanor Hayes, the quiet housekeeper, unaware that she was living in the shadows of a past that had been ripped away from her. Her hands trembled as she clutched the photograph tighter, her pulse a relentless drumbeat in her ears. The air in the hotel felt thick, like the walls were pressing in, suffocating her with every step she took. How could she have forgotten her own children? How could she have let someone take them from her? She needed answers. She needed to understand why Samuel had done this to her. She needed to know what else had been stolen. But most of all, she needed her daughters back. She stumbled into the staff stairwell, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the chipped concrete walls. The hotel was silent at this hour, the weight of the night pressing down on everything. Eleanor pressed her fingers against her temples, willing herself to think clearly, to breathe, but the memories, the fragments slipping through the cracks of her mind, kept hitting her like waves crashing against a breaking dam. A nursery bathed in golden light, the soft scent of baby powder, the feeling of holding two tiny, perfect hands in hers. A lullaby she had sung in the quiet hours of the night, rocking her daughters to sleep. Then, darkness, an emptiness so deep it swallowed everything. A sharp, aching void where her children had once been. Her legs gave out beneath her. She slid down against the cold stairwell wall, her body shaking with something between grief and fury. She wanted to scream, to tear through the lies that had been wrapped around her like chains, to demand why. Why had they done this to her? Why had Samuel let her believe she was nothing? Why had he taken them from her? A noise echoed from the floors above, a soft shuffle of footsteps. Eleanor stiffened. She wasn't alone. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe. Her fingers curled around the photograph in her lap, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Then, a shadow passed across the dim light at the top of the stairwell. Eleanor's breath hitched. Someone was watching her. Her body tensed as she slowly, carefully pushed herself back onto her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. The shadow didn't move. It lingered at the top of the stairs, silent. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Eleanor exhaled sharply, pressing a hand against her chest to steady herself. Whoever it was, they had been following her, watching her, just like outside room 1902, just like at the hidden nursery. Someone didn't want her remembering. She turned, moving quickly down the stairwell, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here, not when someone was clearly trying to keep her in the dark. She had to find a way to get out of the hotel, to get to Emily and Olivia before it was too late. But as she reached the lobby, something made her freeze. The front desk. Rose, the receptionist, was still there, her expression tight as she spoke in hushed tones to the woman in the emerald green coat. Vivian Lancaster. Eleanor took a slow step back into the shadows, watching as Vivian leaned over the counter, her polished nails tapping lightly against the marble surface. Rose nodded, her lips pursed, before sliding a folder across the desk toward her. Eleanor's stomach turned. That was her personnel file. Vivian was looking into her. Eleanor's fingers clenched at her sides. She had to move. Now, she turned, slipping through the back hallways of the hotel, her heart hammering. She needed to get to the penthouse before Vivian could. She needed to make Samuel tell her everything before someone stopped her again. She took the service elevator, her fingers shaking as she pressed the button for the 25th floor. The doors slid closed, enclosing her in silence, the golden light above flickering slightly. The ride up felt agonizingly slow. Every second, every breath felt like it stretched into eternity. Finally, with a soft ding, the doors slid open. She stepped out into the corridor and stopped cold. Samuel's penthouse door was ajar. A strange sense of dread twisted in her stomach. She moved forward slowly, the air thick with something she couldn't name. She pushed the door open further, stepping inside. The fireplace still flickered in the grand suite, casting long shadows across the walls. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat on the table, the ice melting into golden liquid. The air was eerily still, the heavy scent of expensive cologne and leather lingering. Then, Eleanor's gaze fell to the desk in the corner of the room. Papers were scattered across it. Her personnel file, old newspaper clippings, and at the center of it all, a birth certificate. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, her breath caught in her throat. Her name was printed at the top. Eleanor Whitmore. Her daughters' names were listed beneath it. And under Father, Samuel Whitmore. Her knees nearly buckled. He had signed it. He had known all along. The truth was right in front of her. She wasn't just his housekeeper. She was his daughter. And for some reason, he had erased her. A choked sob caught in her throat, the weight of it all crashing over her. Then, a voice from behind her. "I never wanted you to find that." Eleanor turned sharply. Samuel stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. The firelight flickered across his face, making the lines in his skin appear deeper, his silver hair casting sharp shadows across his forehead. His eyes held something she couldn't decipher. Regret, pain, fear. "You lied to me?" Eleanor whispered, gripping the birth certificate in her shaking hands. Samuel exhaled, his gaze falling to the paper before returning to her. "I had no choice." Eleanor's voice broke. "You took my daughters from me." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "I was trying to protect you." She let out a hollow laugh, the sound filled with disbelief. "Protect me from what?" Samuel's expression darkened. "You don't know what you're asking, Eleanor." "Then tell me," she whispered, stepping forward, her hands trembling. "Tell me why you erased my life." Silence stretched between them, thick with everything unspoken. Then, finally, Samuel exhaled. And when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I wasn't the only one who wanted you to forget." Eleanor's breath caught. A chill ran down her spine. Before she could say another word, a soft click echoed through the room, the suite door closing. Eleanor turned sharply, her pulse spiking. Samuel's face paled. "She's here." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She turned just in time to see a shadow move through the dimly lit room. Vivian Lancaster. And in her perfectly manicured fingers, she was holding a set of documents. Documents with Eleanor's name on them. And just like that, Eleanor knew. Vivian had been part of this all along. Eleanor's pulse pounded so loudly in her ears that for a moment, the only thing she could hear was the sound of her own shallow breathing. Vivian Lancaster stood before her, perfectly composed, as if she had just walked into an afternoon tea rather than the middle of a long-buried nightmare. The firelight flickered against her emerald coat, her cold, knowing eyes scanning the room as she delicately held the documents in her gloved fingers. Samuel remained still, his expression unreadable, but Eleanor could feel the tension radiating off of him like heat from burning coals. He knew exactly what this meant, and so did Eleanor. Vivian had always known the truth. She had been part of whatever scheme had stolen Eleanor's life away. And now she was standing here, not as a stranger, but as someone who had orchestrated it all. Eleanor's fingers curled tightly around the birth certificate in her hands, the edges crumpling under her grip. She forced herself to breathe, to stand her ground, even as the weight of everything pressed down on her like an invisible force. "What do you want?" Eleanor's voice was quieter than she intended, but it was firm. Vivian tilted her head ever so slightly, a small, almost indulgent smile playing on her lips. "Want?" she repeated, her voice smooth as silk. "Oh, Eleanor, you misunderstand. I'm not here to take anything from you." Eleanor felt Samuel stiffen beside her. Vivian took a slow step forward. "I'm here to offer you something." Eleanor's fingers twitched at her sides. "An offer?" she repeated, her voice tight. "I don't want anything from you." Vivian's gaze flickered with amusement. "Are you sure?" She gestured toward the birth certificate Eleanor still held in her hands. "You've spent so much time looking for answers, trying to piece together the past. But the past isn't always what you think it is, dear. And sometimes, remembering is more dangerous than forgetting." Eleanor's breath hitched, but she didn't let her expression waver. "Why did you do it?" she demanded, her voice shaking with fury. "Why did you take my life from me?" Vivian exhaled lightly, as if she had been expecting this question. She glanced at Samuel, who still hadn't spoken, then turned her gaze back to Eleanor. "It was never supposed to be like this," she said smoothly. "You were never meant to be in the dark. But circumstances changed." Eleanor's grip on the paper tightened. "What circumstances?" Vivian's lips curved slightly, but it wasn't a smile. It was a warning. "I could tell you," she said lightly. "But once you know, Eleanor, there's no turning back." The words sent a sharp chill down Eleanor's spine. She forced herself to keep her voice steady. "I deserve the truth." Vivian studied her for a long moment, and then, with an air of almost reluctant amusement, she held out the documents in her hand. Eleanor hesitated for only a second before snatching them, flipping through the pages frantically. At first, the words blurred together, her hands shaking too much to focus. But then one line stopped her cold. Legal guardianship transfer of minor children. Emily and Olivia Whitmore. Her blood turned to ice. Her vision blurred. Her breath caught in her throat. Her name was signed at the bottom. Her signature. Except it wasn't hers. The realization hit her like a physical blow. "This is a lie," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I never signed this." Vivian sighed. "Oh, Eleanor, what did I just say about the past not being what you think it is?" Eleanor's hands trembled as she clutched the papers, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Someone forged this." Vivian didn't deny it. Eleanor's pulse raced. "You made it look like I gave them up." Vivian's silence was answer enough. Eleanor turned to Samuel, her eyes burning. "Did you know about this?" Samuel swallowed, the weight of guilt pressing into his features. "It was for your own good." Eleanor let out a bitter laugh, a hollow, painful sound. "For my own good?" She took a step back, shaking her head. "You let me believe I was nothing. You let me think I was just a housekeeper. You let me walk past my own children every day and not know they were mine." Samuel's face crumpled. "I was trying to protect you." "From what?" Eleanor's voice broke. "From being their mother?" Samuel exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "From what came before?" Eleanor's stomach twisted. "Before what?" Samuel hesitated, his gaze darting toward Vivian. But the woman only gave him a knowing look, her eyes gleaming with something unreadable. Eleanor's breath hitched. There was something else, something she still didn't know. She turned back to Vivian. "Tell me." Vivian smiled again, but this time, there was something colder beneath it. "Are you sure you're ready?" Eleanor clenched her fists. "I have nothing left to lose." Vivian tilted her head slightly, considering her. Then, finally, she stepped closer, her voice dropping into something almost compassionate. "Oh, Eleanor," she murmured. "You really don't remember, do you?" Eleanor's heart pounded. "Remember what?" Vivian sighed, her gaze turning almost pitying. "Why you disappeared." A cold weight settled in Eleanor's stomach. "I didn't disappear," she whispered. "Someone took me." Vivian shook her head slowly. "No, Eleanor." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "You left." Eleanor's breath caught. The room spun. "No," she whispered. "That's not true." But even as she said it, something deep inside her wavered. Vivian studied her, then took another step forward, her voice soft but piercing. "You weren't taken," she repeated. "You chose to forget." Eleanor felt like the ground beneath her was crumbling. No, that couldn't be true. She would never leave her daughters. She would never walk away. Except her memory was nothing but a gaping void. Except the pain in Samuel's eyes wasn't just guilt. It was something else. Except deep down, some part of her had always known there was something she didn't want to remember. Her hands trembled. Vivian's gaze held hers, unwavering. "You wanted to forget, Eleanor. And the worst part," she smiled faintly, "we let you." Eleanor's breath shuddered. Everything around her blurred. The room, the firelight, Samuel's sorrowful expression. She had been searching for someone to blame. But what if the truth was that she had done this to herself? She didn't realize she was shaking until Samuel reached for her, his touch hesitant, almost pleading. "Eleanor," he whispered. She jerked away, her mind spinning, her heart splintering under the weight of it all. If what Vivian said was true, if she had chosen this, then who had she been before? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. And for the first time, Eleanor wasn't sure if she wanted to know the answer. Eleanor felt the weight of Vivian's words pressing down on her like a force she couldn't escape. "You wanted to forget." The phrase echoed in her head, looping over and over like a cruel joke. How could that be true? How could she have chosen this? Her hands trembled as she clutched the papers in front of her, the proof of her stolen past crumpling under the pressure of her grip. The firelight flickered across Samuel's face, illuminating the deep lines of guilt carved into his expression. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't stopping Vivian from saying any of this, because it was true. Eleanor felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath her crumbling away piece by piece. She had spent years believing she was nothing more than a hotel maid, a forgotten worker in a grand hotel filled with people who never truly saw her. But now she knew the truth. She wasn't just anyone. She was Eleanor Whitmore. She was Samuel's daughter. She was the mother of Emily and Olivia, and she had walked away from all of it. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she took a step back, trying to distance herself from the overwhelming truth suffocating the room. The walls felt too close, the air too heavy. Samuel took a hesitant step toward her. "Eleanor, don't." Her voice broke as she turned to him, her vision blurred with unshed tears. "Don't say my name like you still have the right to." Pain flickered across his face, but he didn't argue. Eleanor turned her gaze to Vivian, whose expression remained unreadable, her perfectly polished nails tapping lightly against her arm. "If I wanted to forget," Eleanor said slowly, "then tell me why. What was so terrible that I would erase my own life?" Vivian's lips curved slightly, but there was something colder in her eyes now, something that made Eleanor's stomach twist. "That's the question, isn't it?" she murmured. "You came looking for answers, but are you sure you're ready for them?" Eleanor's jaw clenched. "Tell me." A pause. Then Vivian exhaled lightly, as if she had been expecting this. She turned her gaze toward Samuel, arching a delicate brow. "Should I?" Samuel's silence was telling. Eleanor felt something in her chest tighten. "You already took everything from me?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "At least have the decency to tell me why." Vivian tilted her head slightly before stepping closer, her heels clicking softly against the floor. And then, in a voice so gentle it was almost cruel, she said, "You lost someone, Eleanor, and you couldn't bear to live with it." Eleanor's breath caught. "What?" Vivian's gaze held hers steadily. "You weren't taken. You weren't forced into this. You chose to forget because living with the truth was too unbearable." Eleanor shook her head slowly, her pulse hammering. "No, that's not." "You lost someone?" Vivian repeated, her voice softer now, almost sympathetic. "And when the grief became too much, you made a deal." Eleanor's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "What kind of deal?" Vivian's lips parted, but before she could speak, Samuel's voice cut through the room, raw and unsteady. "She lost her husband." The world tilted. Eleanor's breath left her in a sharp, shattering exhale. She stared at Samuel, waiting for him to take it back, to say something, anything, that would make this make sense. But he only looked at her, his expression filled with sorrow. "No," Eleanor whispered, shaking her head. "That's not true." Samuel's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "It is." Eleanor felt something crack deep inside her, something buried so far beneath the surface that she hadn't even known it was there. A husband. She had been married. She had loved someone enough to build a life with them, to have children with them. And then, gone. The pain slammed into her so forcefully that her knees nearly buckled. "You were happy," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You had everything you ever wanted. But then he died. And you weren't the same after that. You weren't you." Eleanor clenched her jaw, her breathing unsteady. "You stopped eating. You stopped sleeping. You stopped." He let out a shaky breath. "You didn't want to live in a world where he wasn't." Tears burned at the back of Eleanor's eyes, her chest tightening with a grief she hadn't even known she carried. "You weren't just grieving, Eleanor," Samuel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were dying." The room swayed. Eleanor felt her body go numb, her fingers curling at her sides. "Then one day," Samuel said, his voice breaking, "you came to me, and you begged me to make it stop. You begged me to take it all away." Eleanor let out a ragged breath, her vision blurring. "I didn't know what else to do," Samuel said hoarsely. "So I gave you what you wanted." Eleanor felt like she was drowning, like the walls of the penthouse were closing in, like she was standing in the wreckage of a life she had abandoned. "You made me forget," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Samuel exhaled. "I gave you a way out, a way to live without the pain." Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, the weight of it all pressing down on her. "And my daughters?" Samuel hesitated. "You said you couldn't be their mother anymore, that it hurt too much to look at them and not see him." Eleanor choked on a sob. "So I took them," Samuel continued, "not because I wanted to steal them from you, but because I thought I was doing what you wanted, what you needed." Eleanor felt a tear slip down her cheek. She had done this. She had chosen this. The realization cut through her like a blade, raw and unforgiving. She had been searching for someone to blame, convinced that someone had stolen her daughters from her. But the truth was far worse. She had walked away. She had let herself forget. And now the memories, the loss, the grief, the unbearable weight of it all, were crashing back down on her, drowning her in a pain so deep she wasn't sure she could survive it. Vivian watched her carefully, her expression unreadable. "Now you understand," she murmured. "This wasn't something done to you, Eleanor. This was something you chose." Eleanor let out a shaky breath. She had spent so long running from the past. But the past had finally caught up with her. And now she had to face it. Eleanor stood motionless, her mind reeling, her body frozen in the weight of the truth she had spent years unknowingly running from. The room felt smaller now, suffocating, as if the very walls of the penthouse were pressing in on her, trapping her in the past she had desperately tried to erase. She had begged for this. She had looked into her father's eyes, shattered and broken, and she had pleaded with him to take the pain away, to make her forget, to erase the unbearable grief of losing the man she loved, the father of her daughters. And he had done it, not out of malice, not out of cruelty, but because he had watched his daughter die in front of him, piece by piece, and he had been too desperate to save her to refuse. Her legs felt weak beneath her as she stumbled back, her breath uneven. Samuel had made her forget. He had let her live in a world where she didn't know she had lost everything. But it hadn't been just him. Vivian had been there too, watching, controlling, ensuring that Eleanor never stepped out of line. Her gaze snapped up to the woman standing across the room, the dim firelight flickering against the cold amusement in her eyes. "You did this?" Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse, trembling with something raw and uncontained. Vivian arched a brow. "No, my dear, you did." Eleanor's fingers curled into fists at her sides, but she was shaking too much to hold onto her anger. She had spent years living a life that wasn't hers, believing she was someone else entirely. But this wasn't just about her. This wasn't just about what had been taken. This was about Emily and Olivia. She had abandoned them. She had left them behind. And they had spent their entire lives being raised by a man who had let their mother disappear rather than face the truth. She turned sharply to Samuel, her voice raw with emotion. "How could you let me do this?" Samuel's face was lined with regret, his eyes heavy with the weight of everything he had carried. "Because I thought I was saving you." Eleanor swallowed back the lump in her throat. "You didn't save me. You let me disappear." His jaw tensed. "You weren't surviving, Eleanor. You wouldn't eat. You wouldn't speak. You..." He let out a sharp breath, as if the memories were too much. "You were drowning, and you wouldn't let anyone pull you out." Eleanor's breath hitched, something breaking inside her. She didn't remember that. She didn't remember the days after he had died, the days where she had lost herself completely. But now it was all coming back in waves. Memories she had buried, memories she had begged to be erased. She saw herself sitting in an empty nursery, rocking back and forth, holding on to nothing but air. She saw Samuel kneeling in front of her, his hands gripping her shoulders, his voice pleading with her to come back. And she saw herself refusing refusing to live in a world without him, refusing to be the mother her daughters needed. She had chosen this. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not now, not yet. Vivian sighed, tilting her head slightly. I imagine this is a rather overwhelming revelation, she mused, examining her nails. But you have what you wanted, Eleanor. The truth. Eleanor's gaze snapped to her, sharp and filled with something unforgiving. I didn't want this. Vivian's lips curved ever so slightly. Didn't you? Eleanor's hands shook as she gritted her teeth. What happens now? Vivian's expression didn't change. That depends entirely on you. Eleanor swallowed. She had spent years in the dark, lost in a life that wasn't hers, and now she had a choice to make. She could walk away. She could leave this all behind, return to the life she had been living, pretend that none of this had ever happened. Or she could fight for her daughters. She could fight for the life she had lost. She could face the pain she had buried and finally be the mother they deserved. Her pulse pounded. There was no choice. There was never really a choice at all. I want them back, Eleanor whispered, her voice fierce with determination. I want my daughters back. Samuel exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. Vivian, however, merely sighed. It's not that simple. Eleanor's jaw clenched. Why not? Vivian folded her arms over her chest. Because you signed away your rights, Eleanor. Your father raised them. You haven't been in their lives for 3 years. Eleanor's stomach twisted. 3 years. 3 birthdays. 3 Christmases. 3 years of first words, first steps, first moments, all without her. A deep, aching pain settled in her chest. But they're mine, she whispered. I never should have left them. Vivian's gaze softened just slightly. Perhaps not, she admitted. But they don't know you, Eleanor. You are a stranger to them now. Eleanor's breath caught. No, that wasn't true. Emily had reached for her that night. Olivia had asked if she remembered them. There was something there, something deep and unbreakable. She wasn't a stranger to them. She was their mother, and she wasn't going to walk away again. She took a slow step forward, her hands trembling, her breath uneven. I don't care what I signed, she said quietly. I don't care what the law says. I don't care what you think is best. They are my daughters, and I am going to get them back. Vivian studied her carefully, her eyes unreadable. Then, after a long moment, she smiled. A small, knowing, almost amused smile. Then I suppose, she murmured. You'll have to prove it. Eleanor stiffened. What do you mean? Vivian stepped closer, lowering her voice. You may have been their mother once, Eleanor, but you have to ask yourself something very important. She leaned in, her words brushing against Eleanor's skin like a ghost. Are you still? Eleanor's breath hitched. Vivian straightened, smoothing down the front of her coat. Because you see, dear, she continued, her tone impossibly gentle. Those little girls are used to a world without you. If you really want them back, if you really want to fight for them, then you're going to have to remind them who you are. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat tight. I will. Vivian gave a soft, knowing nod. Then you better hurry. Eleanor frowned. Why? Vivian tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with something unreadable. Because Samuel made a mistake, she murmured. And he only took one of them that night. Eleanor's stomach dropped. The room spun. Her heart stopped. She took a step forward, her voice raw, panicked. What do you mean? Vivian exhaled lightly, as if the answer was obvious. One of them is missing, Eleanor. Eleanor's body went cold. She shook her head, her breath coming fast. No, that's not. But before she could finish, Samuel swore under his breath. And in that moment, Eleanor knew. She hadn't just lost 3 years with her daughters. She had lost one of them entirely, and she had no idea where she was. Eleanor felt the floor beneath her tilt, her vision narrowing as the weight of Vivian's words settled in her chest like a boulder, crushing, suffocating. One of them is missing. The sentence replayed in her mind, looping over and over, each repetition more unbearable than the last. Her throat closed, her pulse roaring in her ears. No, that wasn't possible. Both Emily and Olivia had been here. She had seen them. She had spoken to them. They had been standing beside Samuel when they arrived at the hotel. Hadn't they? Her mind raced back to that night. The storm. The way Emily had clung to Samuel's hand while Olivia had hesitated, looking at Eleanor like she knew something no one else did. The way she had whispered, "Do you remember us?" Eleanor's breath came fast, uneven. She turned sharply to Samuel, her hands trembling at her sides. "Tell me she's lying." Samuel didn't meet her eyes. A sharp, suffocating silence stretched between them. "Tell me she's lying?" Eleanor repeated, louder this time, her voice rising with something close to desperation. "Tell me they're both safe." Samuel exhaled slowly, the sound ragged, and when he finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, Eleanor felt the last remaining pieces of her world shatter. Because there, in his eyes, was the truth she had been fearing, and it was worse than she had imagined. Her body went rigid, her breath stalling in her lungs. "Where is she?" Samuel hesitated for only a moment before he said, softly, "I don't know." Eleanor's stomach dropped. The world tilted. Her knees nearly gave out beneath her. She shook her head, trying to force air into her lungs, but the panic, the sheer terror of it, was too much. She took a step forward, then another, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "What do you mean you don't know?" Samuel exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face, the weight of years pressing into his shoulders. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he murmured. "I thought I was saving them." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The memories came back in a rush, like a tidal wave breaking through a dam. The night she had seen Samuel running out of the hotel room, his grip tight on Emily's hand, his face lined with confusion and urgency. The way he had looked back, almost as if he didn't see Olivia at all. He hadn't. Samuel had been suffering from the early stages of Alzheimer's. His mind had been slipping even then, and in his confusion, in the panic of the moment, he had made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. He had forgotten that Olivia existed. He had taken Emily, and he had left Olivia behind. Eleanor's breath shuddered, her hands shaking violently now. "You left her." Her voice cracked on the words, barely more than a whisper. "You took one of them and left the other?" Samuel closed his eyes for a brief second, his jaw tightening. "I thought," he swallowed, shaking his head. "I thought I was seeing things. I thought there was only one." Eleanor let out a sharp, hollow breath, something breaking inside her. "You thought she wasn't real?" Samuel looked at her then, something raw and aching in his expression. "I didn't know what was real anymore, Eleanor." Eleanor took a staggering step back, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Olivia had been alone. For 3 years. Her daughter had been alone. Where was she? Eleanor whispered, her voice shaking. Who took her? Who found her? Samuel's silence stretched, and it was Vivian who spoke instead. "She was found in the hotel," she said simply. "The night you disappeared." Eleanor's breath caught. Vivian stepped forward, her sharp eyes studying Eleanor closely. She was alone, confused. She didn't know where you were, didn't understand why no one was coming for her. So she waited. Eleanor's hands trembled as she whispered, "For how long?" Vivian exhaled, tilting her head slightly. 3 days. Eleanor's heart stopped. Tears burned at the edges of her vision, her breath coming fast and shallow. She was alone for 3 days? Vivian nodded. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't eat. The staff tried to help her, but she wouldn't let them. She just sat there, waiting. Eleanor felt like she might collapse. "My God," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She thought I was coming back for her." Vivian's expression remained unreadable. "But you never did." Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, swallowing back the sob that threatened to break free. Her daughter had waited. She had waited, and Eleanor had never come. She had erased herself. She had let Olivia believe she had been forgotten. Her vision blurred with tears, her mind spinning. Where is she now? Vivian sighed, slipping a hand into her coat pocket. That's where things get complicated. Eleanor's heart plummeted. She turned sharply, her voice raw, desperate. Where is she? Vivian hesitated, then exhaled slowly. She was taken in by a woman who was staying at the hotel that night, she said. A woman who said she had been trying to adopt a child for years. Eleanor's breath caught. No, that wasn't. She's been raised by someone else? Vivian's gaze softened just slightly. Yes. Eleanor let out a shaking breath, her hands gripping at nothing. Who? Vivian was silent for a long moment before she said, Her name is Margaret Winslow. Eleanor stilled. The name sent a jolt through her, sharp and unfamiliar, yet somehow wrong. She swallowed hard. Where is she? Vivian's expression darkened just slightly. That's the problem, Eleanor. She reached into her coat, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. She's gone. Eleanor's breath hitched. She took the paper with trembling fingers, unfolding it slowly. It was an address, but the last line was scrawled in sharp, jagged handwriting. No longer resides here. Eleanor's heart pounded. She left. Vivian nodded. And she took Olivia with her. Eleanor's hands shook. Where? Vivian exhaled. That's what we need to find out. Eleanor's breath came fast and uneven, her vision swimming. Her daughter was missing. She had been raised by a stranger. And now, that stranger had disappeared with her. The room felt like it was closing in, the weight of everything pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. But then, a spark, a slow, burning ember deep in her chest. She had spent years in the dark. She had spent years lost. But now she was awake, and she was going to find her daughter, no matter what it took. Eleanor's heart pounded violently in her chest as she stared at the crumpled address in her trembling hands. The words blurred before her eyes, but her mind had already latched onto the only thing that mattered. Olivia was gone, taken, raised by a stranger, and now, that stranger had vanished, disappearing into the shadows of a life Eleanor had never been part of. The weight of it crushed her, suffocating, but beneath the shock, beneath the panic threatening to unravel her completely, something else ignited. A fire, a mother's fire. She had lost too much already. She had spent years in the dark, blind to the truth, but not anymore. She wasn't that woman anymore. The one who had forgotten, the one who had begged to erase herself, the one who had walked away from everything. She was a mother, and she was going to find her daughter, no matter what it took. Eleanor lifted her gaze, her fingers tightening around the note as she turned back to Vivian and Samuel, her voice low and unshakable. Where did she go? Vivian studied her for a moment, something unreadable flickering behind her cold, assessing gaze. Margaret Winslow left the country 3 months ago, she said smoothly. The house listed on that address was sold, her belongings packed up overnight. No forwarding information, no trace of where she went. Eleanor's stomach clenched. 3 months. She had already been gone for 3 months. Olivia had already been moved, relocated, taken further away. She had lost her once. She wasn't about to lose her again. Eleanor turned to Samuel, her pulse hammering. You had people looking into this, didn't you? Samuel hesitated, but nodded. I did. Then tell me what you know. Samuel exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his lined face. Margaret Winslow was a businesswoman, owned a small publishing company, but a few years ago her company went under. She spent years trying to rebuild, but her personal records show she was struggling. Then, out of nowhere, she filed for international residency. Eleanor's blood ran cold. International? Vivian nodded. She was granted a visa for France. Eleanor's breath hitched. France? Samuel nodded grimly. She took Olivia with her. A sharp, piercing silence stretched between them. Eleanor clenched her fists. Her daughter, her baby, was on another continent. A shaky breath left her lips. It didn't matter. She was going to find her. Eleanor squared her shoulders, steel settling in her spine. I need to get to France. Samuel inhaled sharply, shaking his head. Eleanor, wait. No, she turned to him, her voice unwavering. You don't get to stop me. Samuel's face darkened, his jaw tightening. You think you can just show up there and demand her back? She's mine. Samuel exhaled sharply. Legally, she's Margaret Winslow's. Eleanor felt her breath stutter, but she forced herself to keep her expression firm. She never should have been. Vivian sighed, crossing her arms. The law doesn't work on should-have-beens, Eleanor. Margaret has had custody for 3 years. To the world, she is Olivia's mother. You are... She paused, considering. A stranger. Eleanor swallowed hard, her chest aching at the words. Vivian was right. To Olivia, she wasn't Mama. She was just... someone. Someone who had disappeared. Someone who had left her behind. Her stomach twisted painfully, but she shoved the thought away. It didn't matter. She was still her mother, and no legal technicality was going to keep her from her daughter. Eleanor lifted her chin. Then I'll make her remember. Vivian arched a brow, but there was something almost amused in her gaze. You're determined. Eleanor didn't blink. I have to be. Samuel sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Eleanor. No. She cut him off sharply. You don't get to tell me to stop. You don't get to tell me what's impossible. You took my daughters from me once. I won't let it happen again. Samuel's jaw tightened, his expression flickering with something close to pain. Eleanor turned away from him. I'm leaving tonight. Vivian watched her for a long moment, then exhaled lightly. Fine, she murmured. But you're going to need help. Eleanor hesitated. Vivian reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a sleek black folder. These are the last known records of Margaret Winslow's whereabouts in France. Bank transactions, property records, travel history. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she took the folder, flipping it open. There, printed in black ink, was a new address. Eleanor's heart pounded. Margaret was hiding in Nice, France. A slow, steady breath left her lips. She looked up at Vivian. Why are you helping me? Vivian's lips curved slightly, but her gaze was unreadable. Because I want to see if you're really who you think you are. Eleanor didn't respond. She just turned on her heel and walked out of the penthouse. She didn't stop when Samuel called after her. She didn't stop when her hands shook as she booked the next flight out of New York. She didn't stop when she sat in that airplane seat, staring out at the dark, endless sky. She didn't stop because mothers don't stop. She had spent years sleeping in the dark, forgetting, losing herself. But now she was awake, and she was coming for her daughter, even if it was the last thing she ever did.